Okay, well, I think we're probably ready to go. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the last webinar for 2020 in our new series of online events. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. My name is Nell Thompson and I'm the Secretary of the Australian Institute of Animal Management, and I'll be helping with the technical side of this webinar today. I've been on the AIM committee since 2013 and I'm also the coordinator of the National Getting to Zero program. The Australian Institute of Animal Management is the national peak body representing local government animal management officers. The AIM committee consists of a wide range of professionals engaged in the various aspects of animal management. AIM seeks to support those engaged in the business of animal management and the function itself by providing training and information, opportunities for networking and collaboration, and by encouraging the use of best practice policy and practices. AIM understands the significant pressures placed on local government and not-for-profit rescue and rehoming service providers when working in the companion animal management space. We welcome new members and people can join via our website at www.aim.org.au. You may know that each year the AIM committee put together a 3-day workshop consisting of conference-style presentations and practical training presentations. We, of course, had to cancel the 2020 event due to COVID-19, but wanted to ensure that our valued members still had access to continuing education. So we worked on putting together a series of webinars for that purpose. So to the agenda for today. Once I hand over to our presenter, there'll be around 20 minutes of presentation and around 5 minutes of question time once the presentation has concluded before we move to the next presenter. The recording of this webinar will be accessible via our website to all members to watch at any time. We're going to ask that everyone mutes themselves during the presentation unless our presenter indicates otherwise. And if you have any questions, you can start putting them in the chat box and we'll get through as many as we can at the end of the session. If you have very quick questions that relate to your understanding of the content, we will try to get to them during the presentation. If you have more questions or we don't get to yours during the question time, you can send us a message to our Facebook page and we'll get to it that way. As always, please excuse any working from home background noises that may filter through today. So to our first presenters for today, and just before we kick off, I have to let you know we're actually one presenter down today. Unfortunately, Brooke Kennedy has fallen ill with something that has taken her voice away completely, which isn't very helpful for a webinar. So she's disappointed to not be here, but we're hoping to invite her back next year to present on her research. But right now, we're very grateful to have Dr. Bonny Cumming, Program Manager of Strategic Services for Animal Management in Rural and Remote Indigenous Communities, otherwise known as AMRIC. She's presenting together with Dr. Tamara Riley, a PhD candidate at Australian National University. Bonny is a veterinarian and her role with AMRIC is diverse and includes establishing and managing strategic partnerships and projects, monitoring and evaluation, managing the development of the AMRIC app, and policy and protocol development. Bonny has a keen interest in One Health principles, combining community development, veterinary services, and environmental conservation to improve animal, human, and ecosystem health. Tamara is also a veterinarian and is undertaking her PhD focusing on One Health, that is the relationship between animal, human, and environmental health, within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the ANU. Tamara graduated as a veterinarian through the University of Sydney and worked within the Australian Government Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, where she completed a Diploma of Government. She has since completed the Masters of Philosophy in Applied Epidemiology at the ANU and a Professional Certificate of Indigenous Research at the University of Melbourne. So I will hand over to these ladies. Take it away, Bonny and Tamara.
Thanks, Nell. So I'll be presenting first, and then I will jump to Tamara a bit into the presentation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm based, the Waka Waka people. So I'm in southeast Queensland, about 3 hours northwest of Brisbane. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that you're all tuning in from or viewing this recording from. And I thank all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout Australia for their wisdom and guidance. Thank them for their elders' contributions and their leadership, and really grateful that they've been able to contribute to this culturally rich nation of ours. Here we go. So we'll be speaking about capturing and evaluating data from One Health focused remote community animal health and management programs. So, excuse the technical issues, there we go. For those who aren't familiar, AMRIC, or Animal Management in Rural and Remote Indigenous Communities, is a national not-for-profit organisation that applies a One Health approach to ensure that remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities receive culturally safe veterinary and animal-focused education programs. Our vision is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities that are healthy and safe for people and their companion animals. And we exist to assist and empower communities to meet their needs for companion animal health, care, and safety. Our 3 core areas of work are veterinary services, focusing on surgical desexing, zoonotic disease mitigation, and animal welfare treatments. Animal and One Health focused education and training, aiming to build knowledge and local capacity. And then advocacy, strategic planning, and research, working with communities to highlight the practical challenges of managing companion animals by culturally appropriate means within the context of remoteness and limited resources. Through this work, we also work with researchers, connecting them to communities, and together building the health and evidence base of our work. You can certainly learn more about these areas of our work on our website under the What We Do section. But at a broader level, I guess it's important to acknowledge that AMRIC really operates as a knowledge broker, working with and sharing knowledge, catalysing relationships between a complex array of stakeholders, including Indigenous corporations, local government authorities, vet service providers, environmental health and medical organisations, schools and other community service organisations, universities and research institutes, and state and federal government departments. So when we're talking about these animal management programs within this presentation, we're specifically talking about remote community animal health and management programs. So these typically incorporate those veterinary services, animal focused education. Monitoring and evaluation is still critical for these programs, as it is for any program, really. It's really important for due diligence, and it's especially important for continuous improvement. So of course, evaluating our work helps to inform our future plans. It allows us to implement effective strategies, and by continually monitoring and then evaluating as time progresses, we're able to have that continuous improvement cycle. But how can we monitor and evaluate? What is it that we need to monitor and evaluate these programs? Of course, it is data. And so the question is, what data is valuable to capture in monitoring and evaluating these animal management programs? Well, if we take a step back and think about the benefits of these programs, so the benefits of effective veterinary and education programs are many. They include improved animal health and welfare, improved human health and well-being, enhanced empathy development, improved community amenity and safety, fewer unwanted animals, reduced negative impacts on wildlife and ecosystems, and reduced biosecurity risks. Ideally, we'd be able to capture data to monitor and report on each of these benefits. However, data that measures human health and well-being, empathy development, and wildlife and ecosystem health as they relate to veterinary and education program delivery, it's not typically something that's readily available. So instead, we, with our data capture, tend to focus on the animal-based indicators. It's generally much easier to obtain this sort of data. And by capturing and monitoring this data, we can track animal health and welfare, we can track unwanted animals, biosecurity risk, and we can also monitor community amenity and safety. Ultimately, we would love to be capturing data on human health and wellbeing, empathy development, and biodiversity. And we can do that, but they probably require dedicated research projects to allow us to capture that. It's not something that's easily done at this stage at broad scale. So if we think about data, it's really important to think about how we organise data. And certainly in terms of if you're building a database to capture your animal program data, having that organisation from the outset is really critical. AMRIC has a database where our data is arranged in this hierarchy. So at the centre of the database is our animal record. So that animal record is something that can be built on over time. It includes the signalment of the animals, so things like their breed, colour, gender, etc. It also allows us to record health data and record that over time, creating a history. So we can record things like problems that animal might be encountering, treatments that it's being administered, or even procedures that it's had. We can also record things like behaviour and the history of that behaviour over time. So that sort of data is really important then for feeding into things like dangerous dog investigations. Our animal records then sit within a household record, and we can have multiple animal records within the same household. So each household record contains that household's owner's details. It might contain things like household attributes like fencing or environmental health concerns. And we can also record complaints and local government regulatory orders that it might be placed on that household as well. The households then sit within a community, and we can associate things like the vet service programs or the education programs to those community records so that we know which communities have received those services, the frequency of those services. Then those communities sit then within a broader region or a local government authority. The specifics of the fields that we're capturing. So when we think about that animal record, these are some of the things that we're going to capture associated with those animals. Species is really important because the way that you manage different animals depends on their species. You know, the way that you manage dogs is not going to be necessarily the same way that you manage a donkey. So having that species captured is critical. Their gender is, and that links quite closely to their reproductive status. So knowing if they're a male or a female and knowing if they're desexed or entire. Their age, we tend to do that by categories rather than years. But in more metropolitan areas, then you might be capturing animal details by years. We tend to do it by categories such as puppy or kitten, young, adult, and old. The body condition score and the skin or hair score are overall visual indicators of the general health of that animal. So the body condition score uses a numerical score of 1 to 9. That's a pretty standardized scoring system that's common across animal health globally, where 1 is emaciated, basically very thin, and 9 is obese. So an ideal body condition score is a 5. For skin and hair scores, we're looking at basically hair loss, and that can be often associated with things like mites. And so most animals, we want them to have a hair score of 0, where they have no hair loss or good hair. If they have extreme hair loss, if their skin, for example, is crusted and they've got no hair left at all because they've got a severe case of mange, they would be a score of 5. And by scoring these things numerically, or even by categories such as thin, good or fat, it just allows us to really dig down and analyse that data much easier than if we were writing free text responses in all of those fields, of course. Allows us to aggregate that data and look at it at a broad scale. Similarly, for problems, that's why we use a list of pre-populated problems, and we try to encourage people to select from those pre-populated options. Where those options don't fulfill the problem that a person is observing in front of them, they can then enter free text to describe an additional problem that might not otherwise be listed. At that animal population level, it's also, as we touched on before, important to record behaviour data. So things like whether the dog is a biter or a chaser, so that can feed into complaints and regulatory processes. Of course, we're capturing all this data, but what is it that we're aiming for? And so as any sort of a program is implemented, it's really important to have targets that you're trying to achieve. And so given that AMRIC's focus is largely around population management through humane surgical desexing, reproductive status is one of our really important targets. And whilst there's actually not that much literature available out there on setting these targets, our experience tells us that for dogs, if we aim for around 80% of the population to be surgically desexed, we will have quite a stable population. For cats, because they can breed so rapidly, they've got such high fecundity, we actually think that probably needs to be a bit higher. And if we aim for 90%, I'm not saying that we're achieving these targets in all cases. Certainly cats can be very difficult, you know, especially those semi-owned, poorly handled cats, very difficult to trap and catch. And so aiming for 90% of the population of those sort of cats to be desexed is quite a challenge. But at the same time, it's these sort of figures that really are going to lead us to stable populations. Age distribution is also useful to look at in terms of how dynamic a population is. It's difficult to really precisely quantify. Again, there's just not that much data in the published literature about what these targets should be for free roaming populations. But we do know that when we have populations that are really rapidly increasing, we generally have the age distribution skewed down to that younger end of the scale. So we have more infants, we have more young animals around. When we have a stable population, we generally have a more even distribution. So the young and the infants and the older animals are at a more even level. And then if we've got a declining population, we would see the distribution skewed to those older animal end of the scale. We don't tend to see that so often, but you know, if you were looking at the Australian human population, for example, where we've got a declining population, large population of you know, baby boomer generation and older, that's where we have that skewing of that data on that age scale. For our targets for our body condition score and our skin score, well, ideally every dog would be a 5 out of 9 body score, so an ideal body score. But in reality, that's probably an unrealistic target. So if we aim for at least 95% of the population to have an ideal body score or close to it, then that's probably a good aim. Similarly with the hair score, if we aim for at least 95% of the population to have a score of 0, so they've got no hair loss, then that's really ideal as well. Similarly, animal health and welfare problems, inevitably animals get ill or injured. So while we ideally would like to see all animals in all populations with no health or welfare problems, that's not going to be something that we'll ever achieve. So if instead we aim for less than 5% of the population to have problems recorded, then that's probably a good target. I should note that some of these are likely to be seasonally impacted. Certainly animal health and welfare problems in the remote areas where we worked, access to communities over the wet season is really challenging. And so veterinary services are typically only delivered throughout the dry period of the year. That means that there's a protracted period there where communities are going without access to veterinary services. And so in those periods of time, you're likely to see an increase of health and welfare problems recorded. Similarly, you'd probably see an increase in skin and hair scores because with the wet season, we also see increased parasite burdens, and that can lead to increased mites that cause that mange. When we're thinking about the data, it's not just the animal record data that we need to be thinking about. Anything that the program is implementing should really be documented. So from the veterinary program side of things, you'd be recording things like details of the veterinary service provider, the dates and locations of the services that they're delivering. Really important to be tracking costs and monitoring those over time. It's a great idea to ensure that you've got all the collaborating organisations recorded and that you've got those stakeholders listed for appropriate acknowledgements and also future program collaboration. Typically, as part of remote community vet service programs, the vet will provide a report after the service delivery that will include details of any treatments delivered. But if the vets aren't reporting on that, then they should be. And that's really important information to have collected as well. Most of the communities that we're working with, bylaws are not actually implemented or even in existence. So regulatory data is not something that we're dealing with commonly. However, in some areas, obviously this is really important. But we can still capture a fair bit of information out of the data that we're already capturing. We can still grab that information, things like the number of animals per household. Because we've got that hierarchical system, we can jump through the layers and look at, for example, the average number of animals per household in a particular community. I should note here, with remote communities specifically, we do see a lot of human household overcrowding. And so what that can mean is that if each person or a few of those people in that household at least have animals, that seems like a larger number of animals per household. And if we look at the data, it's quite remarkable when you look at it, animals per household versus animals per human population. At the household level, there certainly seems to be an increase in animals compared with more urban areas. But if you look at it at the human population level, then it's often really on par. So it's really important, I guess, to have that context and that background knowledge when you're analysing data, because the way that you portray data can really shape the way that the audience has receives that data, but their perspective on therefore that community. Another really important part of regulatory data is, of course, the dangerous dog complaints and investigation records. Again, that's something that's not unfortunately occurring in great detail in many remote areas, but is something that, you know, would be great to be seeing being performed in more detail. And certainly the new AMRIC app, which I'll speak about shortly, will allow for recording for records to be captured associated with that. And then any other animal management activities that are being delivered. So, you know, education programs, what was the key messages promoted, who was engaged, and who was delivering that education. So AMRIC, as I've alluded to, have an app that allows us to capture all of this sort of information. Our existing app we've had for about 5 or 6 years. It's really a prototype that we're actually in the process of redeveloping so that we have even more features in the new app. The existing app is based on a system called FileMaker, when it was built, it was only available on Apple devices, which was obviously a big limitation and something that we're addressing with the redevelopment. So the existing app we use on iPads. I'll give you a very brief run through just so that you can see some of those features and how that data is organised. So we start at a regional council or a local government authority. So for example, Cherbourg here. We then select the communities within that regional council or local government. Cherbourg only has one community within its council area, hence there's only one community listed. We then are taken to the community summary page. So you can see here, there's lots of different rows, each with a different address. So they're the different households within that community. That allows us to record that household by either lot number or by street address, if they have street addresses. It allows us to show the owners for those addresses and also a summary of the total numbers of dogs or cats present at that household. Our new app will also allow us to capture other species as well. If we then select one of the households from that list, it'll take us to this page, which is the household summary. And you can see there, it gives us a summary of the address, the owner, and the animals contained within that. If we scroll down a bit further, you can see there's complaints section, which is a history table, as well as free text notes, just for any sort of random information that you want to store against that household. So from the household page, if we click on one of those animals, it takes us to the animal details page. So this is where we start to get into a lot more detail. You can see all the signalment data, things like their microchip number, their gender, their reproductive status, their age, their body condition scores, etc. We can also, as you can see, take photos of those individual animals, and we can take different photos over time as well. We can record problems. So these are some of the pre-populated problems that we might commonly see in remote communities, but these are all editable and can be varied depending on the location where you are capturing data. If treatment is required for that animal, you can assign that treatment to either an AMW, an animal management worker, or a vet, and that will allow that animal's record to be listed on the job list for future visits. Cheeky dogs are quite common in remote communities, and so that's the term we use to describe these behavioural attributes. Sometimes these might be behavioural attributes that are associated with dangerous dogs. Some cheeky dogs are more just mischievous than truly cheeky though. But as you can see, we can record details. It also, the new app will allow us to record these details in a timeline format as well, so that you can see when these behaviours were being noted. And also, of course, if you are giving treatments, you can select the treatments from a pre-populated list. Again, these are ones that are fairly commonly used in remote communities, but these are all editable depending on the location as well. These would then be recorded in the treatment history table so that you can build on that treatment history over time. A few years into the development of the existing app, we realised that that level of detail, that animal details page, was probably beyond what we needed for a lot of the work that we're doing now, which is simply a census. So if we go to a community and we go door to door, we want to know how many animals are in that community and what condition they are in. So that's when we designed this light or census version, which it uses the same fields, it's just simplified them. So instead of, for example, a body condition score, which is a numerical score from 1 to 9, we now have just 3 categories of thin, good, or fat. And they match up to those numerical scores, so that if a person is viewing the same community, they can view it on either the light version or the full version, and they can still see that data. It's just got a different label on it. So a thin dog, for example, would be a body condition score of 2. A good body condition in the light version would be a body condition score of 5 in the full version. So what that allows us to do is work with groups like ranger groups or different community organisations, the community development program, staff members. It allows us to work with people for whom English is not their first language and for whom literacy may be a challenge. It really is designed around checkboxes rather than having to enter text, and it's quite visual in its layout. So it allows us to really work with community residents to capture that census data. And when we can get that full community census data, and particularly over time, we can really start to monitor and evaluate populations, as Tamara has done, which she'll talk about shortly. So very briefly, the new app, we will have individual user logins. So that allows us to track who's entering the data. It also allows us to set security permissions based on the individual users. We will have lots of accessibility features. So recognizing that a lot of our residents that we're working with might have visual deficits or hearing deficits, being able to have these accessibility features is really critical. What I'm quite excited about is this spatial mapping capability. So we'll be able to capture GPS points associated with households, and then we can start to associate that with the different data in the database. So things like total populations and population density, we could start to map that out. Things like disease events, where we're seeing things like ehrlichiosis, which is a new tick-borne disease detected in Australia for the first time in May this year, which is spreading rapidly through remote communities in the NT and WA. With this GPS mapping capability, we'll be able to actually map that out as users are recording that an animal has signs of that disease. We'll also be able to assign tasks to and message users. So that's really useful for within app communication. You won't have to jump out of the app and send a text message to the vet. Instead, you can do it all from within the app. And that will also allow us to do things like developing job lists, so that, if an animal management worker is working in a community and recognises that an animal, say an owner has requested an animal to be desexed, they can add that animal to the job list, and the vet will get that list when they arrive with all these animals already listed and what it is that the owners are requesting for those animals. There'll be a whole range of within-app reports, which will be really useful for users to be able to just quickly have a jump in and look at these different sort of reports as they're going, things like the total animals dissected within a time period, the different treatments given within a time period, or the total animals in their population at the present time. We'll also be able to record property attributes, so things like whether the yard is fenced, whether the gates are functional, those sort of things, environmental health applications as well. Additionally to the app itself, there'll be a desktop portal. So this is a website-based login, which will have the dashboard, which shows where basically a summary of all the communities that that user has access to, that's live and based on current data. And from within this portal, users will also be able to go in and edit and pre-populate different fields. So like their commonly used problems or their commonly administered treatments, all of those will be editable at the individual user level. So how do we then use this data? Well, I talked a little bit already about censuses. So that's where we're going door to door within a community and capturing a whole community's worth of animal records. Often we're using that as a snapshot in time. So we can then, if we then start to layer that and look at multiple snapshots over time, we can get a sense of how that population is tracking. Censuses, I should say, are really important too if you are yet to embark on an animal health or management program, you're about to implement something or you're changing direction. It's really important to get that baseline data, get that baseline census so that you know the condition of the animal population before you start implementing anything. Because once things have started to be implemented and the conditions of the animals start changing, you can't wind back the clock. You can't go back and get that original data. So getting that baseline is really, really important. Companion animal population data, it's really useful, I think, and one of the ways that AMRIC really looks at it is in terms of benchmarking. So we work with a lot of local government authorities, a lot of different Aboriginal organisations who are implementing these services, and we can work with them to start benchmarking their animal management programs, allowing them to identify where there might be some room for improvement, and to showcase where they are really tracking ahead in leaps and bounds. And you just can't do that without data, but data is the key to that sort of tracking. And building into that benchmarking really related to it is the ability for data to inform animal management plans and to really guide where those programs are headed. So it can identify the priorities that need some further work. It allows local governments and other stakeholders to quantify and actually cost out the scale of services that they require, which is obviously critical for budgeting. And it's really also useful for helping to justify resources, you know, where you are achieving goals, being able to document that we've had this improvement because we've had this investment. And so we would like to sustain that investment so that we continue to have that improvement sustained. So at a big picture, what happens when we start aggregating this data at a really high level? Well, we've been involved with a few different events where we've been looking at this data and been able to use it and to inform things like emergency responses. So for example, when Cyclone Trevor went through and I think about 5,000 people were evacuated from the Roper Gulf region, their animals were unable to be evacuated in that event. But we had really good data on the companion animal populations in that region, thanks to our collaborators at Roper Gulf Regional Council. And that meant that we could share that data with state emergency response teams. And in fact, we were involved with the immediate response, and some of our staff members, our veterinary staff members, were amongst the first on the ground after the SES had been through. What that data meant was that we knew at each household what animals to expect there. And therefore, in planning for that response, we were able to say that, yes, within this community, there's 247 animals. We therefore think we'll need, 50 bags of dog food or whatever the response is. But it really allowed that tailored planning at a really critical point in time. And so we were able to respond rapidly with that data. Similarly, this information is really useful for that broad scale biosecurity surveillance. And in fact, we've partnered with the National Australian Quarantine Strategy on a number of programs where we're working with ranger groups to collect that census data, including the program at Wadeye, which Tamara will speak about shortly. Brooke Kennedy was going to speak about emerging cat population issues in remote communities, and that's something that we've definitely been able to identify through this sort of companion animal population data. And long term, ultimately, what I would really love to see is that we start to overlay this data with other sort of data sets. So that human health and well-being data, empathy and emotional development, and also the biodiversity and conservation style data, so that we can really see where those benefits are having beyond just the animals themselves. So a specific example then of how we've used this data is the Wadeye Animal Health Program. So this was a program where we had great collaboration with Tamara Development Corporation and their ranger group, with the Australian National University, obviously Tamara representing ANU, with West Daly Regional Council, the local government authority for that region, and AMRIC. We also had some additional support for this program from the NT Department of Health Environmental Health branch. So in 2015, the Tamar Development Corporation staff member came to AMRIC and said that they were concerned about the health of the companion animals in their community, that there really wasn't much happening in terms of animal health within that community. There were occasional vet visits, but it didn't seem to be coordinated. There was very little local involvement, and that they really felt that there needed to be a different approach. Tamar Development Corporation are an Aboriginal organisation at Wadeye that focus on community development within that community. And so they were able to say, look, you know, we can see this is a problem for our community, but we really want to be part of the solution. We're really keen to be involved as this solution progresses, but we need some technical advice on how to progress this. AMRIC obviously operates in this space very commonly, so we were able to collaborate with Tamar. We got West Daly Regional Council involved because as the local government authority within the Northern Territory, they are delivering regular animal management programs anyway. So the collaboration was formed in 2016. We managed to get some funding through a grant at that time as well. And then in 2017, the program was implemented. So what did the program involve? Well, there were biannual vet visits. So these were coordinated and delivered by AMRIC and our partners. And the Tamar Rangers were able to receive some training for AMRIC, and they were then able to assist us with each vet visit, which is really crucial. Having that local liaison, that local knowledge as a visiting vet service provider is so invaluable. And we're really grateful for Tamar for being able to assist in that way. We train the Tamar Rangers also to deliver bi-monthly anti-parasite treatments in the months, particularly between the vet visits. So that helps to maintain the health and welfare of that population in between the, excuse me, the biannual vet services. With the Rangers, we use the AMRIC app to capture and monitor impacts of the program by doing an annual dog and cat census. And so that's the data that Tamara has then been able to utilise. And we also had the Rangers became inherently really the point of contact for the community in regards to identifying and being that conduit between the vet and the community in regards to animal health referrals. Tamar Development Corporation also has an environmental health program called the Healthy Homes Program. And so animal health referrals actually became formally part of that program thanks to this broader collaboration, which was really great to see too. So we were collecting this data, we were delivering these services, but we really wanted to know, does the implementation of this program actually improve animal health? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because I'm going to hand over to Tamara. Hopefully we will coordinate the tech pretty easily. But thank you for listening to me, and I will hand over to Tamara.
Thanks, Bonny. Yeah, so as Bonny said, my role was to evaluate the program in Wadeye, and ultimately we wanted to see if the implementation of the program improved animal health. And the main outcomes we looked at was dog body condition score, dog hair score, and the desexing rates of dogs and cats. So to analyse this, we used 3 years of companion animal census data and also 12 months of veterinary visit data. So this is the logic model that we designed for the program. And the use of this was really as a communication tool. So to show how the main inputs and activities will lead to what we hope will be the intended outcomes and impacts of the program. So this logic model was designed with help from Dr. Erin Walsh at the Research School of Population Health. And so I'll just really quickly go through the results of the evaluation. So to assess the outcomes, we looked at the animal population and compared health outcomes of dogs and cats from June 2018 to June 2019, so over 12 months. In 2018, there was approximately 653 dogs and cats in Wadeye, with the majority of those dogs. And in 2019, there was around 633. So there was a small decrease in the cat population, but over that 12 months, the population remained fairly stable. And on average, there was around sort of 3 to 4 animals per household. So from June 2018 to June 2019, 3 veterinary visits were delivered, in which 259 animals received treatment and 183 of these animals were surgically desexed over the 12 months. So in terms of desexing rates, so the graph on the left is the desexing rates of cats. So the blue bar is cats that are desexed, the orange is those that are not desexed, and the grey is the missing data. So you can see in the blue bar, so from 2018 to 2019, the rate of desexed cats increased from 22% to 31%. However, there was sort of a quarter of data in 2019 unavailable. In the graph on the right, so this is dogs desexing status. Again, the blue bar shows that desexing rates of dogs increased from 18% to 37% over 12 months. And the missing data over this 12 months also improved. So in 2019, there was only 17% of data missing. So we also looked at body condition and hair score. So the graph on the left is body condition score of dogs. So you can see, so the orange bar shows normal weight and the blue bar shows the underweight dogs. So the rate of dogs with normal weight increased from 49% to 77%. And over the same period, underweight dogs decreased by 26 to 14%. And if you also look at the yellow bar on this one, you can see that the missing data improved significantly over that 12 months. So around a quarter of the data in 2018 was missing, but in 2019, only 5% of the data was missing. So that's really great. And then the other graph is hair score of dogs. So we had to look at 2017 compared to 2019, as we had a problem with data in 2018 where we lost a lot of the data. So thankfully, because we had that third census, we were still able to make a comparison. So the blue bars here show the normal hair score. So you can see this improved from 69% to 80% over that 12 months. So the purpose of the evaluation was to assess whether animal health outcomes improved over the period of program implementation, and we found that it did. So results showed significant improvement in all animal health outcomes. There was a decrease in the overall animal population, an aging dog population, and there was also fewer households that had large numbers of animals. So these were households with 10 or more animals. And so the strengths of this program is really the community-driven aspect of it. So this was a community-driven solution to a community-identified challenge. And we also saw this program delivered with leadership by the rangers, and this was really important for engagement within the community. So if you'd like to know more about the evaluation, we have recently published a paper on it in the journal Animals, so you can follow this link to find more information. And we would just like to acknowledge the TDC Rangers who were really vital in running this program, my supervisors at ANU, and the National Indigenous Australia's Agency who support AMRIC's programs. If you'd like to contact either of us, please feel free to email and we're happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamara. That's fantastic. Does anyone have any questions? I'm just looking through the chat we've got here, and I can't see anything specifically for you guys, but jump in now if you'd like to. Otherwise, we'll get Liam to pop his screen up. But I don't know about everyone else, but that was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate it, and the amount of work that is going on in Indigenous communities. We would love to see things like that happening in our mainstream communities as well. It's amazing how advanced things are in our Indigenous communities, which is fabulous. But we'd love to see it all across the board. So well done, ladies. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I hope you hang around for our next presenter. We have Liam Deans-Pope. Over the past 10 years, Liam has worked with domestic animals in a wide range of roles, including animal attendant, animal management officer, behaviour trainer in a busy Victorian shelter, and greyhound behaviour assessor. He has several industry-specific certifications, is a certified dog behaviour consultant, CDBC CSBD, with the IAABC, and has completed a Bachelor of Animal and Veterinary Bioscience with honours. Liam owns and operates Dog's Body Animal Behaviour, a training and consulting business based in the Dandenong Ranges, specialising in helping owners with any and all problem behaviours, and has a particular fondness for working with fearful and anxious dogs. Further, his time working with retired racing greyhounds has given him a keen interest in canine predatory behaviour. So over to you, Liam.
Hi, Nell. Thanks for the introduction. It's very nice of you. Alrighty, so like Nell said, my name's Liam. I'm going to be talking to you today about my honours project, which was an investigation into the effects of the exposure of other breeds of dog prior to presentation for a prey drive assessment on the rate of dog and dog predation in retired ex-racing greyhounds. Before I start, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to my awesome supervisors, Richard Peters and Diana Raymond, one of who's tuned in today. And also I completed this project while I was working as a greyhound assessor for the Greyhound Adoption Program, or GAP. And as such, the assessment data all comes from dogs passing through their program. All right, so firstly, I should point out that in regards to mammalian carnivores, intraspecies predation or predation on a member of a predator's own species is really uncommon. Predatory behaviour is an innate genetically programmed motor pattern which follows a predictable sequence, which is orient, eye, stalk, chase, grab, bite, dissect, and consume. It's usually stimulated by a fast-moving prey animal, such as a rabbit or another prey animal such as that. It's been somewhat modified in greyhounds through selective breeding to reduce some aspects, such as the stalk and the dissect, and to increase others, such as the chase. So to kind of illustrate this, I've included a short video as well here of a couple of greyhounds getting a hold of a lure, just so we can see how this sequence kind of ties in with the racing. So as you can see, these guys come chasing out after lure. Lure driver's a bit slow today. Dogs spin around and get a hold of it.
We're having a great day. I don't think the swearing's too far away.
All right, so obviously dogs do have instances of aggression that have nothing to do with predatory behaviour, and as such, it's pretty important to note the difference between social aggression and predatory aggression. So social aggression is typically observed as an attempt to, in a response to a stressful situation, such as protecting a resource like this little guy down here with his food bowl, or to make a competitor leave an area or something along those lines. Predatory aggression is more of a food-getting behaviour, and as such lacks that strong sympathetic arousal we tend to see with social aggression. So unlike social aggression, predatory behaviour is actually quite enjoyable for the dog, and as such, given more opportunities to practice it, they're more likely to repeat the behaviour over and over. All right, so for those of you unfamiliar with greyhound racing, I'll give you a little bit of background. Greyhound racing is actually a pretty limited industry, only really found in the USA, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. Australia produces about 7,200 greyhounds every year, and the amount of time that they're actually kept racing isn't all that long. So they're usually retiring by about 3 to 5 years old. The racing industry relies quite heavily on individual adoption programs from state to state to place them into homes once they're finished with their racing career. And they do tend to vary quite a lot from state to state in regards to what their procedures are, what their assessment processes are, how many dogs they've got coming through their doors, all that kind of side of things. GAP is the Victorian one, obviously, and it's an initiative funded by the Greyhound Racing Victoria, which assesses the suitability of greyhounds for living as pets once they're finished up racing. And we'll also get them ready for pet life kind of thing in terms of desexing and dental work and anything else they might require. There hasn't been a huge amount of research into the success of rehoming retired racing greyhounds. A couple of papers, one based in Italy and another one looking at dogs in Australia and New Zealand. They did find that predatory behaviour towards smaller breeds of dog was a fairly common concern for these guys when they're looking at issues for dogs once they're in homes. So before a dog is adopted out and it passes through GAP, it must pass a prey drive assessment. So the way this kind of works, give you a bit of a walkthrough of it kind of thing. The owner of the greyhound or the participant submits the dog for assessment. We get a bit of information regarding the greyhound's past experiences, including whether it's been around other dogs before, if so, what kinds, how many, all that kind of side of things. Tends to vary quite a lot in regards to the responses we get. So you'll find some who will have been around a lot of other dogs, quite a few others who they've only really ever been exposed to other greyhounds. And so the first time they're seeing another breed of dog is when they're meeting with the assessor dogs in the assessment. So the greyhound is tested with 2 small breed assessor dogs, first on lead and then off lead once the dog's been able to greet them appropriately. The greyhound is muzzled to reduce the risk to the small dogs. And once they've been able to greet appropriately on lead, the dog's let off lead and the small dogs are cued to run across the yard. So the greyhounds then watch for any indications of that predatory motor sequence we spoke about before. So chasing after, attempting to grab, all that side of things. The test is continued until we're satisfied that the dog's either not going to display any extreme predatory behaviour or it's done something which is a bit more concerning, which we've decided to make a stop. So it's worth noting as well that just because the dog might have passed the GAP assessment doesn't mean it hasn't displayed any predatory behaviour at all. It's really more looking for that extreme responses, like attempting to grab the dog or something. Maybe once the dog's actually been in the yard and running around with the small dogs for a little while, it's been able to have a bit of a sniff. It's showed like a reduction of interest. It's kind of showing all those indications of behaviour that it's treating it as if it's another dog. Predatory behaviour can be a little bit tricky because it is quite easy to suppress. So for example, the dog's feeling a bit uncomfortable in the environment, or if it's just had a big meal or something like that, you might find that a dog who in other circumstances would attempt to predate isn't going to on that day. So to try and get around that, the assessment is repeated on a couple of different days, and they're looking for that consistency of a response across multiple assessments. If you've got a dog who's a particularly nervous dog or something like that, they may also send it out to foster for a couple of weeks just to kind of build up its confidence, and then bring it back and reassess it when they think it's more likely to give a true assessment of its behaviour. So all of this assessment data is stored in an electronic database, which I had access to for this project. So I've got another short video here of a greyhound demonstrating what we consider to be a more extreme predatory behaviour. So as you can see, dog walks into the yard, hasn't really noticed them yet, sees the small dogs and his ears pop up and he really orients towards it. Much more tense, very focused. Comes over for a very stiff, rude greet and then attempts to grab. As you can see, this kind of stuff is why we really need to be really careful about the assessment and making sure that these guys aren't potentially going out into homes where they may repeat this behaviour out in the street. So I had 2 primary goals for this project. First of all was to examine the predictive validity of the GAP's prey drive assessment. And second was to establish whether retired racing greyhounds that had interacted with other breeds of dog prior to presentation were less likely to attempt to predate on the other breeds of dog. So first step I took to meet these goals was a telephone survey. While it seemed probable that the GAP Predation Assessment was doing a fairly good job at weeding out these dogs who are going to display more extreme predatory responses, it hadn't actually been formally validated. So I figured before I did a actual assessment project on it, it would be worth doing a quick assessment just to see what kind of responses they're getting. I spoke with 47 adopters of ex-racing greyhounds that had passed through the GAP assessment and had been deemed as non-predatory, towards other dogs that is. All participants had lived with their dog for at least 6 months, and I asked them a range of questions in regards to whether their greyhound had displayed any aggressive behaviours while they'd owned it, and if so, what was it towards, what was the situation, what was the environment, where was the location, all that kind of stuff. Importantly, I didn't ask any specific questions in regards to whether the dog had displayed any predatory behaviour, as you tend to find that a lot of people really struggle to identify it. So you're better off asking for descriptors and kind of making assessments based on what you're seeing from that. So a lot of the time people will mistake it for either play behaviour, or they might mistake it for more of like a social aggression side of things. But when you kind of tease it out, you can see that it's not necessarily what's going on. All right, so this chart was completed using the responses to this survey, this telephone survey. So 65%, or this large green wedge, hadn't really shown any aggressive behaviours towards other dogs while they'd had it. 21% had shown some kind of aggression, but it was generally consistent with more of like a fearful aggression or something along those lines. Only about 6% had displayed any behaviour which was consistent with, potentially being predatory behaviour. There was also another 6% who had shown some kind of aggression, but the owner wasn't really able to give enough information to give a clear idea as to what was going on there. So just kind of labeled that as other. So this is also predatory behaviour towards other dogs. So as you can see, this big chunk over here, 93%, hadn't really displayed any predatory aggression towards other breeds of dogs since they've been in the home. Smaller section over here, so the 6%. So we've got predatory behaviour towards other dogs inside and outside the home. Generally, that was either while they've been out walking or something, or I think there was one circumstance where a Jack Russell had come running into the property and they'd seen some behaviour they were really concerned about. So after the telephone survey, so this last chart actually looks at predatory behaviour towards other species other than dogs. So it found that 59% of them hadn't displayed any predatory aggression towards any other kind of animal, whereas 41% had displayed some kind of predatory intent, usually either towards possums in the backyard or potentially, cats while they've been out walking or something similar to that. This is pretty consistent with what we would expect to see, just because the whole prey drive assessment is very much looking at intraspecies predation. And just because a dog has recognized another dog as a dog and he's not going to attempt to predate on a small fluffy thing, doesn't mean that he's not going to chase after a cat or something similar when put into the circumstance. All right, so after the telephone survey, my next step was to go through the GAP assessment database for an 18-month period and review all the assessments of greyhounds that had passed through the program. This left with a cohort of about 205 dogs. So GAP conducts assessments at a number of sites around Victoria and with a number of different assessors. So to kind of minimise variability, I only looked at the assessments that were done by 2 specific assessors, and I only looked at 3 locations. Specifically the Meadows Greyhound Racing Track, the Sandown Greyhound Racing Club, and the GAP facility in Seymour. So when I reviewed the data, I found there wasn't really a statistically significant difference between the assessments at each of the locations. And further, that sex and age didn't really seem to have an overall effect on the behaviours that were observed from the dogs during the assessments. So next, I compared the number of times groupings of behaviours were observed during the assessments, specifically pro-social behaviour, antisocial behaviour, avoidant and predatory. Pro-social behaviour is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. It's, coming over to the other dog, polite sniff, all that kind of, appropriate social behaviour. Antisocial is kind of the opposite of that. So you may have some leash reactivity, barking, growling, all that side of things. Avoidant behaviour is very much just trying not to interact with that dog at all, pretending it's not there. And predatory behaviour is really any of that predatory sequence that we discussed just before. So I also looked at the difference between dogs who've been socialised on lead and off lead, depending on the circumstance, just because it was one of those things where GAP specifically asked whether the dog had met other dogs on lead or off lead before. So it gave me a bit of an opportunity to look at the difference between those 2 things. All right, so these guys on the left are the dogs who've never had any social interaction with other dogs off lead prior to their pre-assessment. This grey bar here is the mean rate of pro-social behaviour that was observed. As you can see, it's considerably lower in the dogs who haven't had any off-lead socialisation, whereas the dogs who have had some off-lead socialisation with other breeds of dog before were more likely to display pro-social behaviour. This blue bar over here is predatory behaviour. So once again, so you can see there was much more likely to observe predatory behaviour from dogs who'd never had any socialisation off lead before, compared to these guys over here who had some kind of socialisation. So this graph represents the relationship between on-lead socialisation and whether or not pro-social behaviour was observed. So as you can see, there was considerably more, the mean pro-social behaviour was considerably higher in dogs who had some kind of on-lead socialisation before compared to those who hadn't. However, it didn't seem to have an overall impact on the rate of predatory behaviour that was observed. All right, so finally, I undertook a qualitative survey of people who've adopted their greyhounds. I asked a range of questions with a focus on instances of predatory behaviour or social aggression that their dog had displayed while they'd had it. I also asked the participants to complete a couple of verified dog behaviour questionnaires, specifically the CBARC, or Canine Behaviour Analysis and Research Questionnaire, and the DIAS, which is the Dog Impulsivity Assessment Scale. Findings of the CBARC were not overly enlightening, so I won't go over too much of that stuff there today, but we'll have a little bit of a chat about the DIAS. So the DIAS consists of 18 questions, and that the participant is asked to answer on a 5-point Likert scale, which then we used with a couple of calculations to get an overall questionnaire score and 3 subscores. Impulsivity or impulse control in regards to dog behaviour is used to describe a dog's ability to inhibit its responses to a stimulus. And for this presentation, the relative information is that a higher overall score correlates with a more impulsive dog. So as I was saying before, just because a greyhound has passed the predation assessment at GAP doesn't mean it's never displayed any predatory behaviour. The greyhounds that did not display any intra-species predatory behaviour obtained lower overall questionnaire scores than the dogs who did, potentially indicating that dogs that were behaving in a more predatory fashion were also behaving more impulsively. Which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because they're kind of not really taking the time to sniff and recognize the other dog as a dog. They're kind of just moving straight into that sequence. All right, so to review my original goals. So firstly, it appears like the GAP Predation Assessment is accurately identifying greyhounds that are unlikely to attempt to predate, as intraspecies predation seems to be fairly infrequent in GAP greyhounds once they're actually in a home. And in terms of the effect of socialization with other breeds, it seems like the off-lead socialization does significantly reduce the amount of predatory behaviour observed and increase the pro-social behaviour observed in dogs who have had off-lead socialization. Dogs that had only experienced on-lead socialization were significantly more likely to show pro-social behaviour, but didn't really seem to have an overall impact on the predatory behaviour observed. All right, so in conclusion, intraspecies predation is a major factor in determining if an ex-racing greyhound is safe to put into the community. And the findings of this study indicate that retired racing greyhounds are more likely to display pro-social behaviour and less likely to display predatory behaviour if they've had some kind of off-lead socialisation with other dogs prior to presentation. So these findings lend themselves to the recommendation that breeders and other members of the greyhound racing industry can increase the suitability of their retired racing greyhounds for transitioning to pet life, with some appropriate off-lead socialisation with other breeds of dog prior to presentation. This may help decrease the number of animals which are euthanized and also increases the safety of the animals which are being placed into communities. Yeah, so that's it, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
That is super interesting information and so relevant for what many local governments are potentially dealing with every day when thinking about off-lead dog areas and things like that. A question from me, Liam, in terms of the behaviour that greyhounds or any dog might show when it's displaying predatory behaviour, would you expect vocalisation to be one of the components of that?
Not usually, no, because it kind of is one of those things where if they're trying to sneak up on a rabbit or a bird or something like that, and they're really vocalising quite loud, they're kind of giving away the game a little bit. So one thing you do tend to see a bit is if the dog is on lead and is kind of restrained and they kind of lunge to the end of the lead and then can't get any further, you'll see that frustration barking. So you'll see, barking, carrying on, screaming and stuff. But, typically from like an off-lead behaviour, you probably wouldn't. So.
Okay, so it's going to be very difficult for your average dog owner to pick a behaviour like that, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And often it kind of varies a bit from breed to breed. I think with greyhounds, there's the benefit of, you're looking at the same shape of dog every time. So you can kind of go, cool, what's the set of their ears doing? What's the crinkle between their eyes doing? Are they really focused towards it? All that kind of stuff. So yeah, which I think makes it a little bit easier to identify when you're just looking at one set shape. So
yeah, that's an excellent point. And just thinking about other breeds that show modified predatory behaviour, for example, your herding breeds, is that something that you would expect is fairly set in stone with them, or do they occasionally you know, lose the plot and go for the whole sequence, or?
I think you definitely can do. Like, you can have, you know, your standard pet domestic dog who will still show the whole intact predatory motor sequence, and even the ones who have been bred for like a modified version, like your herding dogs and things like that. Sometimes you will have one who will, you know, progress more towards a bite or something like that. I think they're probably more in the minority, considering they've got such a long breeding history of these guys being selected for not harming the stock. But you will still occasionally get ones who are thrown up who will show that behavior too. So yeah.
Okay, we've got a question from Christina here. Liam, wondering what your view is on council designated greyhound off lead areas.
Yeah, so I think it's probably quite a good idea, because most of these guys will they tend to behave really appropriately towards other greyhounds, because it's, you know, typically what they've been around is what they consider to be dogs, if that makes sense. So I think if you've got a specific area where it's, you know, fully fenced and it's unlikely to have, you know, some random fluffy walk in and things like that, then it's probably quite a good idea, because it's a nice controlled environment where the dog can run around and the owner can interact with other owners and things like that. So yeah, I think it's a nice, safe way of managing that problem.
And I guess considering the changes in our legislation in Victoria that we've seen recently, that might be a good way to go, or at least to examine the issue. Do we have any questions from anyone else? I think the presentations today have been fantastic. We have missed Brooke, but hoping to get her back next year. If there aren't any more questions, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming along. Stay tuned to our social media pages and e-news for announcements on next year's webinar series. We're rapidly trying to put that together, so we're hoping to have a really good lineup of more interesting topics and speakers for you to tune in on. Feel free to send us through any suggestions too, if you have topics or speakers that you'd like to see in this webinar series. Please let us know. We are keen to hear what everyone wants to do. And just looking, no more questions. Great job, Liam. Yes, excellent job, Liam. Excellent job, Bonny and Tamara. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here. Thanks everybody for coming along. All the best for Christmas and New Year. Stay safe and happy and healthy. And we hope to see you in 2021. Thanks, everybody.